Good evening. Hope all of you are doing well. Tonight we're going to be learning Daf Ches Amud Beis and Daf Tes and Daf Yud Amud Aleph. We're going to push all the way to the Mishnah at the bottom of Daf Yud Amud Aleph. It's actually a pretty smooth flowing Gemara with the exception of one little chunk. Otherwise, it's going to be pretty quick and relatively easy. And again, we're at the top of Daf Ches Amud Beis on the second line. Says the Gemara, Ches Amud Beis line 2, Amar Reb Levi Mishum Rabbi Meir. Sukkos shel yotrim. If you have two sukkahs of the yotrim, zolifnei mizu, yotrim are those who are like potters, they make pottery. So it says the Gemara, if there's one sukkah within the other, namely, the only way you access the inner sukkah is by going through the outer sukkah. So in a case like that, hapnimis ein a sukkah, the inner sukkah is not considered a sukkah, it's considered a house, and therefore v'chayeves b'mezuzah. Of course, it has to be a minimum of 4x4, but under those circumstances, it's considered a bias, the inner one. V'achitzona sukkah, but the outer sukkah that leads into the inner sukkah, the outer sukkah is considered a sukkah, v'sukkah, and p'tura min mezuzah, and because it's a sukkah, by definition, it's not going to be chayiv in a mezuzah. So asks the Gemara 5 lines down, Ches Amud Beis, asks the Gemara, ve'amai, why is it that the outer sukkah is not a bias? Says the Gemara, ve'amai, it should be that the outer sukkah is like the foyer to the inner sukkah. It should be considered part of that inner sukkah and therefore chayiv in mezuzah and therefore not a sukkah. Answers the Gemara, under normal circumstances, you'd be right, except that here, mishum de lo kviya. Here, because it's not a kviyas, it's just for sukkah. So therefore, that outer sukkah that leads to the inner sukkah, the outer sukkah is considered kosher as a sukkah and the inner one is not. Tanu Rabbanan, we're a third of the way down on Daf Ches Amud Beis. Says the Gemara, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught us, it should say Sukkahs Ganbach. This is an acronym standing for Gimel Nun Beis Ches. What's the Gimel? Sukkahs Goyim. If you have a sukkah, it's a not halachic one because they're not Jewish, but it's a sukkah. Halachically speaking, it's a sukkah, but he's a goy. Or Sukkahs Nashim, a sukkah that's being used by a woman who's exempt from the mitzvah of sukkah, or Sukkahs Behema, it's a shelter being used for animals, halachically a kosher sukkah, but used for animals, and Sukkahs Kusim, all of these 4 sukkahs, that's Ganbach, it's Goy, Nashim, and Behema, and Kusim. Of course, many times throughout Shas, the Kusim have different definitions. Sometimes they're treated as Goyim straight up, sometimes they're treated as confused because we're not sure if and when they converted, if that conversion was valid or valuable. So the Kusim here are considered to be a Safek Jew. So that's part of the Brisa, the Ganbach. And then another part of the Gemara, 1/3 of the way down, says Sukkah Mikol Makom, and all other sukkahs, very strange language, Ganbach, these 4 sukkahs, and all other sukkahs are kshera. Ubilvad, says the Brisa, provided that Shetehei Mesucheches Kehilchasa, provided that it has schach that is halachically kosher. Asks the Gemara, my kehilchasa. This is now no longer the Brisa. This is now the Amoraim speaking. So what is considered schach kehilchasa? Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Chizda hushasa l'tzeil. That if it was made to generate shade, it had to be made that way. That the sukkah has the schach and kosher form. That was the goal of it. Okay, and then why did the Brisa say sukkah mikol makom? You already told me Ganbach, you told me that the sukkah in which a goy resides, a sukkah in which nashim reside, a sukkah in which behema reside, a sukkah in which kusim reside, all of those are kosher. And then you added in this vague line of sukkah mikol makom. So says the Gemara, la'asuye mai, what are you coming to include? Answers the Gemara with another acronym. La'asuye sukkahs rakbash. There's another type of sukkah that has acronyms. And then the Gemara is going to say, why do we need both brisas? What's rakbash? Halfway down, Ches Amud Beis, the Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis have taught us that a sukkahs rakbash, what is the reish kuf beis shin? Sukkahs roim, where shepherds live. Sukkahs kayatzim, these are people who take care of figs. Sukkahs borganin, a sukkah of those who do security. It's like a security booth, but a halachically a sukkah. Sukkahs shomrei peros. It's a little hut where people who are taking care of fruits, they sit during the day. And then here too, in the Rakbash Brisa, we have the same additional line of sukkah mikol makom kshera. So in 2 different Brisas, it has the same line. We're going to have to figure out why this is the case. And this Brisa as well concludes with the same line, provided, of course, that the schach is kosher. And here we ask the same question on the Rakbash Brisa as we did on the Ganbach Brisa, which is, that actually it must be the case that the schach was put there for shade. Now the same question we asked on the Ganbach Brisa, we're asking on the Rakbash Brisa, Sukkah mikol makom la'asuye mai. Why here did we say that extra line? You were very specific in the Mishnah. It had to be for Roam, it had to be for Kayatim. What is the vague reference? Answers the Gemara, la'asuye sukas ganbach. So The brisa about ganbach, about goyim, nashim, and behemon kusim, it adds in with a code word of sukkah mikol makom to add in the rakbash of the roim and the kayatzim and all the other people in the second brisa. And the same thing happened in the second brisa that they added in the first. So why are we doing this? Just put them all in one brisa. So then the Gemara makes a distinction between the two brisas. We're 5 lines from the bottom. I want you to think about what we're about to read in the same way that we would learn a tzricha, v'tzricha. If not for X, we wouldn't have known Y. And if not for Y, we wouldn't have known X. It's the same formula that we're about to see here without the words v'tzricha. Says the Gemara, Hai Tana de Ganbach, the brisa of Ganbach, Alima, that's a more powerful brisa. Alima le Ganbach mishum de kvi'e, because those sukkahs are actually meant to last. They weren't made for halachic purposes. The guy wasn't making the sukkah because of sukkahs. He lived in it. The nashim didn't need a sukkah because they're pater from the turos from the mitzvah. She just made it to sit out in the shade. And the behemoths, they're animals. They didn't make it. The owner made it so that they could sit there. And the last one is kusim, no halachic purpose to make it. So those sukkahs are long lasting. So the concern of the Gemara is that you might have thought by Ganbach, by these 4 types of sukkahs, that they're different than the other ones because they're kviye. The katana mikol makom la'asuye rakbash delo kviye. And because the brisa about Ganbach, the build of those sukkahs was more long term, we were concerned that he might have excluded rakbash because all of those are people who are chayiv in the mitzvah. The roim, we're assuming they're Jewish in the context. The kayatzim, the people who were taking care of the figs, the burgan and security guards, shomrei peros, they're all Jewish, which means that their sukkahs are temporary. So what was the Ganbach brisa doing? The Ganbach, those brisas are more long-term. And he needed to include the short-term ones as well to make sure that we knew they were kosher. And then on the other side, the Haitana de Rakbash, the author of the second brisa, which speaks about Jews who own those sukkahs, Alima le Rakbash de b'nei chiyuvaninu. Though that brisa, which speaks about the roim and the kayatzim and the burganan and the shomrei peros, so those people are yidden and they have an obligation in the mitzvah of sukkah. So their sukkahs were halachic in nature, and maybe we would have thought that it was different than the Ganbach because they're not halachic in nature. V'tana mikol makom la'asuyi Ganbach de la b'nei chiyuvaninu. And the author of that second brisa wanted to include the Ganbach, the sukkahs of those people, that they're halachically kosher. And this is going to lead us right into the following question, which is a little bit teased out of the Gemara right now, which is, does a sukkah have to be made lishma? Now, when the sukkah was made for the Ganbach, for the goyim and for the nashim and for the behemoths and for the kusim, it wasn't made lishma. But the Gemara seems to say that that's perfectly fine. Now, by tzitzis, as we're going to see in the Gemara today, tzitzis has a din lishma. A lot of mitzvahs have a din lishma, but seemingly sukkah is not one of them. And that brings us to the Mishnah at the very top of Testament Aleph. Sukkah yeshana. What if you have a sukkah that's very old, which we'll define shortly? That's a machlokes tanaim. Beis Shammai postlin ubeis Hillel machshirin. And if you take a look at Rashi, second line, Dibra Maskal, Beis Shammai postlin. What does Beis Shammai hold? Why is it puzzle? Because he holds that this sukkah yeshana is the ba'u sukkah lishma. V'zeh stam na'ases. A sukkah needs to be made for the sake of the mitzvah of sukkah. And this sukkah of a sukkah yeshana was made stam. And how do we know that? Because take a look at the Mishnah. What does the Mishnah say? Second line, Testament Aleph. Ve'ezo hi sukkah yeshana kol she'asa kodem lachag shloshim yom. Anyone who builds a sukkah outside of 30 days prior to Sukkot, l'chora, you're not building it for Sukkot. Aval, what?
But isn't the sukkah called the sukkah when schach is on top of it, so you can build it for walls all around?
But Beis Shammai holds that you have to build it lishma. The Gemara at the bottom on Chesem and Beis doesn't say that because we hold like Beis Hillel. But Beis Shammai was of the opinion that a sukkah must be built lishma. When we make tzitzits, it has to be made lishma. Tefillin, they have to be made lishma. Sukkah has to be made lishma according to him, but not according to Beis Hillel. That's the next shita right here. But so that's what the Gemara says, is how do we define a sukkah yeshana? You made it a month earlier, by the 15th of Elul, by the 14th of Elul, let's say, 30 days prior, right? So that's already considered not to be, if you didn't make it for those reasons, or we assume that if it's outside of 30 days, that it's not made for sukkahs. The Mishnah concludes, Aval, imasal l'shem chag, if in fact you do make it for the sake of sukkahs, even though it was more, even if it's much earlier, the halacha is that it is considered a kosher sukkah. So, B'kitzur, our Mishnah highlights a machlokes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Does a sukkah need to be made lishma? Yes or no? According to Beis Shammai, we require that a sukkah to be made lishma. And according to Beis Hillel, we don't require the sukkah to be made lishma, and that is what we are going to analyze for the next Amud. Says the Gemara, my time of the Beis Shammai, 5 lines down, Testament Aleph. Why does Beis Shammai hold the way that he does? Why does Beis Shammai say that a sukkah requires lishma? Answers the Gemara, Amar Kra. It's a pasuk in Chumash. Chag HaSukkos Shivas Yamim LaHashem. The holiday of Sukkot of 7 days should be LaHashem. Sukkah HaAsuya L'Shem Chag Ba'inan. It's like so simple the way Beis Shammai reads the pasuk. The pasuk says you need to do it for Hashem. You did it for the animals, not kosher. That's not lishma. So that throws a question back to Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai just quoted a great pasuk that said that you have to be lishma. So what does Beis Hillel do with that? Says the Gemara, Beis Hillel is like, no, Beis Shammai, that's not how you read the pasuk. Hahu, that pasuk of Chag HaSukkos, Nahumi Boile, Lichad Rav Sheshes. That pasuk is needed for another reason, which is the opinion of Rav Sheshes. Ta'amar Rav Sheshes Mishum Rabbi Akiva. Minayin la'atzei sukkah she'asurin kol shiva. Rav Sheshes says, in the name of Rabbi Akiva, how do we know that the sukkah itself is asur b'hana'ah all 7 days? All 7 days. Machlokes Rishonim, only the schach or even the walls. That's the machlokes here in the Rishonim. So Talmud Lomar says Beis Hillel that I know that there is an Isser Hana in the sukkah. Talmud Lomar Chag HaSukkos Shivas Yamim LaHashem. So Beis Shammai, you wanted to learn that Lishma comes from this pasuk. You can't do that because Rabbi Akiva used that pasuk already to teach us that there's an Isser Hana using the materials of the sukkah. Vitanya and the Brisa writes, Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira Omer, Kishem shechal shem shamayim ala chagiga. Just like by the Korban Chagiga that's brought on Sukkot, it has the halachic status of Chagiga. It's Chal Shem Shamayim. Says the Gemara, Kach Chal Shem Shamayim al HaSukkah shene'emar Chag HaSukkos Shivas Yamim LaHashem. Machag LaHashem. Just like the Chag is for Hashem, the Korban Chagiga is going to be for Hashem, and it is Asur Behana. Af Sukkah LaHashem. So says the Gemara, the basic pshat in the Gemara as to why Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel argue about whether or not there's Hana is how do we understand the pasuk. Beis Shammai looked at the pasuk and he's like, oh, it says LaHashem, it has to be Lishma. Beis Hillel is like, no, LaHashem means that there's an Isser Hana by the sukkah. Oh, so that's the Gemara's answer. And then the Gemara throws back at Beis Shammai. What are you talking about? Beis Shammai nami mi boy le lahachi. Beis Shammai, you can't say that this pasuk teaches you Lishma because there's no other Mari Makom for us to learn the Isser Hana by sukkah. You have no choice. You can't say that this pasuk says that it's lishma. You're wrong. And the Gemara agrees and says the Gemara, the well-known phrase, inachanami. You're absolutely right. This can't be the pasuk of Beis Shammai to prove that a sukkah is lishma. Ella mai tamayu de Beis Shammai. What then is the reason that Beis Shammai is of the opinion that a sukkah must be built lishma halfway down? Ksiv krachrin, another pasuk says in Chumash, Chag HaSukkos ta'aseh lach shivas yamim. A sukkah should be made for you for 7 days. Sukkah ha'asuya l'shem chag ba'inan. It has to be made l'shem chag. Otherwise, it's not kosher. Same question we asked before with Beis Hillel. Question mark. What are you going to do, Beis Hillel, with this pasuk? Beis Shammai brought a second pasuk. Okay, we rejected the first one, but now he has the second pasuk. So it says the Gemara. Beis Hillel is like, no, you don't understand. Hahumi boile leosin sukkah b'chulo shel moed. See, there's a separate machlokes Beis Hillel Beis Shammai connected to this one that we already had as to whether or not one is allowed to build a sukkah during Chol HaMoed. Let's say that a person did not have the opportunity for whatever reason to build a sukkah before the first days of Yom Tov. Now it's Chol HaMoed, and the only sukkah he's going to have is one that he builds. Beis Hillel says, build the sukkah. Where does Beis Hillel learn it from? From this very pasuk from which Beis Shammai learned that it needs to be lishma. Well, if that's true, so then what does Beis Shammai do with that? Beis Hillel says you're not allowed to build a sukkah during Chol HaMoed. Beis Hillel, svir lehu Rabbi Eliezer. To Amar ain't. Beis Shammai, thank you very much. Beis Shammai, who says that we learn lishma from this pasuk, what does he do with Beis Hillel's understanding of Beis Shammai? He says, svira lehu Rabbi Eliezer. Beis Shammai says, I hold like Rabbi Eliezer. De Amar enos and sukkah b'chulol shamoed. Where does he get it from? The pasuk shivas yamim. If your sukkah is not up for 7 days, it's just not a sukkah. You're not building a sukkah during Chol HaMoed. It has to be up all 7 days. So now each of the shitas can stand on their own. Beis Shammai looks at the pasuk that we now quoted the second time, that the pasuk says about Chag HaSukkos Shivas Yamim LaHashem. About the other pasuk, Chag HaSukkos Tasa Lach Shivas Yamim. From there, Beis Shammai learns Lishma, and from there, Beis Hillel learned that you can build a sukkah during Chol HaMoed. Now the Gemara is going to throw a question at Beis Hillel. We're 2/3 of the way down, 10 lines from the bottom on Testament Aleph. We almost always hold like Beis Hillel. One of the exceptions to the rule of Beis Hillel is Beis Hillel Beis Shammai is this Masechta by the minimum shiur of a sukkah, which is Rosh Haruba v'Shulchana, which is Beis Shammai.
So according to what we do, you cannot build the sukkah during Chol HaMoed?
No, Beis Hillel is lenient. Beis Hillel says you can, so we'd be lenient. Yeah. So now the Gemara is very bothered by the Shita of Beis Hillel, because Beis Hillel was of the opinion that a sukkah does not need to be built lishma. So says the Gemara, I don't understand. Beis Hillel, in our Mishnah, you said that this sukkah yeshana that was not made lishma, you said that everything is mutter v'mutter, that it's a kosher sukkah. So says the Gemara, Leis lehu de Rav Yehuda amarav. You don't hold. Let's look at the. It's a funny line because Beis Hillel lived well before Rabbi Yehuda Amarav. So the Gemara obviously it's speaking in content. It's not speaking in historical terms. Beis Hillel, Leis lehu, you don't hold of the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda Amarav, who lived well after you died. What happened over there? Da'amar Rabbi Yehuda Amarav. Rabbi Yehuda Amarav says, Asa, if a person makes a talis, mina kotzim, mina nimin, mina garden, these are three types of inferior types of thread, psula. Mina sisin, if it's going to be made from a ball of thread, that's different, that's kshera. That's the shita of Rav. Now remember that Rav Yehuda learned under Rav, and when Rav died, Rav Yehuda went to go learn under Shmuel. So then the Gemara gives us the historical note, Ki amrisa kame de Shmuel, when Rav Yehuda was now learning under Shmuel. He was quoting a lot of the Torah that he learned under Rav to Shmuel. So Ki amrise kame de Shmuel, when Rav Yehuda switched from Rav to Shmuel and quoted this line, that min ha sisin kshera, that tzitzis can be made from the ball of thread, even if it's not lishma. When it was said to Shmuel, Amar li, he said to me, Rav Yehuda's talking, af min ha sisin nami psula. He says, no, you're not allowed to do that. Why not? Deba'inan tvia lishma. Because we need the, I don't know if it's called the twining of the thread, when the thread is being put together. Even that needs to be lishma. The tvia needs to be lishma. Just making the thread into a thread. So says the Gemara, Hachanami nibai sukkah, suya lishma. If we hold that way in regards to talis, then why don't we also hold that way in regards to sukkah? It's a colossal question. What mitzvahs have to be done lishma and what mitzvahs don't have to be done lishma? So we're only, of course, talking about mitzvahs of asiyah, like hands-on creation of things, tzitzis and tefillin and writing sifrei Torah, all of the things that are very bi'adayim. To do a mitzvah, we have to daven and do the mitzvah of lulav and esrog. What is lishma? That's not lishma. That's not maybe when you put put it together, it has to be lishma, maybe. But the Gemara is bothered. Rav Yehuda Marav, Rav Yehuda now in the name of Shmuel says it has to be lishma when you make a talis. Why wouldn't we say the same exact thing when it comes to sukkah? Namely, Beis Hillel, where does all of this come from that you say that there's no din of lishma by a sukkah? Says the Gemara, shani hasam. The case of talis is totally different than the case of sukkah. Why? 5 lines from the bottom, damar kra, because over there by talis, what does the pasuk say? Gdilim taselach. The pasuk says you have to make tassels, and that the drasha is lach l'shem chovcha. You have to make it for you. That when you make them, they have to be lishma. But there is no such pasuk by sukkahs. Says the Gemara, that's not true. Hachanami chag sukkos taaseh lach. Lach l'shem chovcha. There's another word lach that says by sukkah also. So if your drush says the word lach and gedilim taseh lach, and therefore it has to be lishma by talis, I've got the word lach in the psukim by sukkahs. Maybe we should say it also has to be lishma over here too, Beis Hillel. So answers the Gemara, no, you can't do that because that word lach was already used. 3 lines from the bottom. That's to tell you about a case of gzula, about a sukkah gzula. That's not to tell you that it should be lishma, but that if a sukkah is gzula, you cannot be yotzei the mitzvah. But that's not about lishma. That's about owning the sukkah. It's totally different halacha. It's not about lishma. It's about ownership. Oh, hasam nami mi boile ligzula. Maybe we should also say by tzitzis that that's the case. As a Gemara, don't worry, that word lach is still available by talis to be lishma. In our case, it doesn't have to be lishma, says Beis Hillel. Why don't we need that word? Because hasam ksiv kra acharina, which is ve'asu lahem, the pasuk ve'asu lahem tzitzis mishelahem. Namely, it can't be guzzle. So the Gemara now answers this question. We're clean and clear in Beis Hillel land. Why we asked on Beis Hillel, how could you say that a sukkah doesn't have to be built lishma? And Beis Hillel's like, give me the Mari Makomos. What do you haven't given me anything to chew on? Oh, talis is unique. What about the word lach? We have it by sukkahs too. That pasuk's used for gzula. You can't just make things up. And Beis Hillel is standing strong that a sukkah does not need to be made lishma. And that's how we paskin in halacha, that if a sukkah is made in halachic terms, kosher schach, kosher walls, we do not hold like Beis Shammai, we hold like Beis Hillel, that as long as the sukkah is halachically kosher in its structure, we don't need it to be built lishma, and that brings us to the top of Testament base.
That's why God can build a sukkah, shul sukkah.
Mm-hmm.
Where the custodian can build a shul sukkah.
That's a great question, but seemingly that would be the case, yeah.
Yeah,
Because that's Ganbach. That was the Brisa. Ganbach, he's a goy.
But like I mentioned earlier, isn't the sukkah called a sukkah when Succah is on top of it?
Yes.
So a goy can't. Yeah, a goy can do the 4 wall part.
Why can't he put up the schach?
You just
Then it's called a sukkah.
That's what we're talking on a doraisa level. Would it be a sukkah if the Jew put on the sukkah? So no psak is happening here. But when you look at the Gemara, it says a sukkah is going. What do you think? He asked the Jew to shake the schach? No, he built a sukkah because he wanted shade. Happened to be mitzil samurba mechamsa. It was kosher.
But that's not a sukkah for a Jew to use.
We don't care about lishma. That's how we paskin like Beis Hillel.
I guess I'm going for help for shaman.
Maybe you're a Shammai Jew. I don't know. Top of Testament Bays, brand new Mishnah. Ha'osa sukaso tachas ha'ilan. A person who makes a sukkah underneath a tree. Ki'ilu aso b'soch habayis. By the way, very strange language. Say psula, like every other Mishnah we've seen so far. Why does the Gemara go out of its way for this mashal of an answer? It is as if it is inside your house. So the Gemara is going to be done that language, very strange language. Sukkah al gabe sukkah, famous shaila in the postgame, and we're going to go through a semi-confusing piece of Gemara at the bottom of this page, going on to the top of Yud Amud Aleph. Says the Gemara, if you have one sukkah on top of the other, the upper sukkah is kosher, and the bottom one is psula. We are going to go through 4 iterations of sukkah al gabe sukkah at the bottom of the page. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, he says a strange language as well. If nobody lives in the upper sukkah, if someone has to live in the sukkah, that doesn't make any sense. The Gemara is going to ask that question as well. Amar Rabba, let's go back to the first din of our Mishnah. We said that if a person builds a sukkah underneath a tree, it's as if you built it in your house. I ran a sukkah business in high school, very profitable when you're 17, 18 years old. And there was someone in the community, not our community, in the suburbs, and they said, please build my sukkah right here. And I looked straight up, and it was definitely under a tree. It was definitely under a tree. So are you allowed to build a sukkah? It's a great shiur lamdas. Am I allowed to build a sukkah? Every time he makes a bracha in that sukkah, I led him to that because now his bracha lebatal. It's not a sukkah, right? Because the tree is above him. It's ki'ilu, it's in his house. That's one shaila. The whole lumdus of whether or not it's allowed. Okay, I ended up moving the sukkah with permission. We moved it over so that it would be halachically kosher. But this is why that's problematic. So Amar Rava, when we say that a sukkah that's built under a tree, it's as if it's in its house. Lo shanu. When do we say that that's true? Ela be'ilan shatzil samaruba mechamso. That's true in the case where the tree is very thick brush, 50% plus of shade over sun. So it's a relatively thick branch line. Aval, if it were to be chamso meruba mitzilsa, let's say you build a sukkah, and when you look straight up above the footprint of the sukkah, there's more sun than shade. The halacha is kshera, the sukkah is kosher. So says the Gemara, mimai, midikatani kilu asab esoch habayis. Where do we get this from? That if there's more sun coming through the branches than the branches giving off shade, that it's kosher. Where do we get this from? Says the Gemara, from that very strange language in the Mishnah. What was the strange language in the Mishnah? Midikatani, what did the Brisa write? Kilu asab esoch habayis. It's as if you built it in the house. Lama li lemisne kilu asab esoch habayis. Why did the Mishnah use that language? Lisne psula. Say what you always say when a sukkah is not kosher. It's puzzle. This isn't poetry class. Give us a psak halacha. Why did you give us the strange language? So the Gemara says, I'll tell you why. Ella, the reason why we had this strange language was to teach us a lesson. Hakamash malan, to teach me the following. The ilan dumya debayis. The only time the sukkah under a tree is puzzle is when that tree is similar to a house. Ma bayis silso meruba mechamso. Just like in a house where, please God, our roof is more solid than allowing sun in. So too, says the Gemara, af ilan silso meruba mechamso. The same would be true of a tree that's silso meruba mechamso, with the implication that being that if the tree is more sun than shade, then it should be kosher. Says the Gemara, so what? Even if it's true that there's only 30% shade and 70% sun, that's schach psula. That's not kosher. So let's say I built myself a sukkah right here. Straight above is tree. The tree is 30% solid and the sun is coming through. Says the Gemara, I don't understand. Good job. Your tree that's above your sukkah is 30% solid and the rest is all sun. That should be okay. But my have, but the schach that's in the tree is schach pasel. Because it's mechubar lekarka. That's with the language missing from the Gemara. But the reason why that schach is puzzle is because it's attached to the ground. Who cares if it's only 30% solid? It's schach puzzle. And the schach puzzle in the tree should join the schach kosher in the sukkah and make it puzzle. Why does it work that the tree is not so solid and therefore more sun's coming in than shade and therefore it's kosher? It shouldn't be kosher. It's schach puzzle. Says the Gemara, 1/3 of the way down. Amar Rav Papa. Bishechavtan. Bishechavtan means we're going to be blending in the tree that is more sun than shade. We're going to be blending in those branches with the branches that are already on the sukkah, we're going to lower them into the schach. So let's imagine that we had a sukkah, and the sukkah was about this high, and the tree branches were hanging over here, but the tree branches were very thin. They were very sparse, less than 50%. So the halacha is that as long as you lower it into the schach and blend it in, then it's batel. And Rashi says that it's batel midoraisa because bittel always works. So as long as the very thin, sparse branches above your sukkah are lowered and merged into the trees, you're good to go. So we have a combo deal. It's not just that if there's a sukkah under sparse branches that it's kosher. It's two features. It has to be sparse branches, and those sparse branches have to be woven into the sukkah. That's what the Gemara means. B'shechavtan. Take a look at Rashi. Rashi is about a quarter of the way down. Dibur hamaschel b'shechavtan. What should we do? Hishpil anafav lemata. We should lower the branches down into the schach of that particular sukkah. Me'uravim im schach kasher. We're going to mix the schach pasel, the sparse branches, with the schach kasher. Ve'ein nirin ba'ain. We won't be able to see them so well. V'schach kasher rabba alav. And there's going to be more kosher schach than there will be pasel schach. And then here's the key language. Umevatlo. Dimi deoraisa kol mili batel beruba. Unbelievable. This is crazy. You have let's call it 30% of your schach is connected to the ground. It doesn't make a difference. It's batel. How could something be batel if it's attached to the ground? That's what Rashi says. Bittul works. And that's the Gemara's answer, a two-part formula. The sukkah has to be under a tree that's relatively sparse, and the branches have to be lowered and woven into the schach of the sukkah itself. So it says the Gemara, a third of the way down. Well, if that's the case, that you're lowering them down, then of course bittel's going to work. I mean, it wasn't obvious to us, but it was obvious to the Gemara, to the Amoraim. If you're lowering down the branches and it's sparse and it's the minimum, of course there's going to be bittel. Why then are you even? That should be obvious. It says the Gemara. No, we're going out of our way to teach you this din of b'shechavtan because ma'odetema nigzor hecha dechavtan. We should have made a gzera of where it was lowered atu hecha delo chavtan, where someone actually did not lower the branch. Maybe we should have a gzera derabanan that lowering it shouldn't help because maybe you'll forget to lower it. Says the Gemara kamashmalan delo gazrina. That therefore the reason why we had an explicit statement about shechavtan was to teach us that there's no gzera about lowering it out of concern that we might not have lowered it. But says the Gemara, Hanami Tanina, we already learned that there's no gzera in this case. Where did we learn this? Says the Gemara. Hidle aleh hagefen v'hadolas v'hakisus. Kisus, yeah. So what a person does is they basically drape over the sukkah things that grow on vines. So gefen is a vine. Dolas is some type of gourd that grows on a vine. V'hakisus, which is ivy. A lot of the homes here in Chicago have ivy. So, and you hang it over the sukkah, v'sikech al gaban. And you put schach on top of those three items. The halacha is psula. But v'imhaya sikuch harbe mehen, if the schach was more than the other items, o shekatzitzan, or if you cut those vines that were holding up those fruits or those growths, then the halacha is kshera. So says the Gemara, what is going on in this brisa? Heichidami, ilema b'shelo chavtan. If you say that the case here is where these vines were not woven in and lowered into the schach, then how come it's tarif schach paslim schach kasher? That brisa would make no sense. If you're not lowering down the vines merging it into the schach, then of course it's going to be pasel because it's schach pasel. It's not woven in, it's not batel. El alav, it must therefore be that this brisa is talking about kishachavtan. It must be talking only about a case where the vines were merged into the schach. And Shma Mina, we already see the lo gazrina. This brisa showed us explicitly that there's no gzera in this case. So then why do we have two brisas saying the same thing? Answers the Gemara, because Ma'udetema, you might have thought that Hani Mili, that B'shechavtan, the lowering down of these branches into a tree is bidi, into the schach is bidi eved. Says the Gemara, Abalachatchila lo. You might have thought that it's not okay in an ideal world, that Kamash Malan, that's not the case. Let's say we were poskim from this Gemara, it's mamish mutter. You have a tree above your sukkah and the branches are relatively low and it's sparse. Halacha l'maisa, in quotes, because it's just what the Gemara seems from here. It seems to be that you can just lower it in and blend it into your sukkah, and it is totally 100% fine, not b'di'evid, but even lichatchila. Okay, 2/3 of the way down at the two dots. We said in our Mishnah at the top of this Amud on Testament Bays, the case of Sukkah al Gabe Sukkah. Where do we know that Sukkah al Gabe Sukkah is problematic? Says the Gemara, Tana Rabbanan, Basukos Teshvu. You should sit in Sukkos. V'lo b'sukkah tachas sukkah, and not in a sukkah that's under another sukkah. V'lo b'sukkah shetachas ha'ilan, and not in a sukkah that's under a tree. V'lo b'sukkah shetachas habayis, and not in a sukkah that's under a roofed house. Says the Gemara, are you even reading the pasuk in Chumash? Look at the words. Adarabba, Basukos. Tarte mashma. The word sukkos is plural. It seems like basukos teshu, you should sit in two sukkahs. Isn't that what the words mean? You should sit in sukkahs in the plural. So the Gemara is saying, you just tried to learn from the word besukos that you can't have a sukkah tachas sukkah. No, the word is plural. So says the Gemara, going back a couple of days, remember, yesh em lemikra, yesh em lemosora, says the Gemara, Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak basukas ksiv. There's no vav in the Torah. We read it basukos, but the actual word looks singular, so therefore the drasha above stands. And the reason how we know that sukkah tachas sukkah and sukkah tachas ilan and sukkah tachas abayis, the reason how we know that those are usher is in fact from the pasuk of basukos teshvu, because basukos is written without a vav. Amar Rav Yirmiyah. Pa'amim sheshtein ksheros. When you have a sukkah tachas sukkah, sometimes both of them can be kosher. Pa'amim, sometimes sheshtein psula. Sometimes both are puzzle. Pa'amim shatachtona ksher v'ha'elyona psula. Sometimes the lower sukkah is kosher and the top one is not. And pa'amim shatachtona psula v'ha'elyona kshera. And sometimes the bottom sukkah is puzzle and the top sukkah is kosher. Let's go through all four of these cases. 6-7 lines from the bottom. Pa'amim sheshtein ksheros. When do we have a case when both sukkahs are kosher? Hechidami, says the Gemara, kegon shatachtona, where the lower sukkah is chamsa meruba mitzilsa. If the lower sukkah does not have enough schach, the elyona tzilsa meruba mechamsa, and the one up top does have enough schach, then and as well, I should say, the kaima elyona besoch esrim, and both sukkahs are within 20. So then that is how we have a case where both sukkahs are kosher. What about the next case? Pa'amim sheshtein psulos. Where's a case where both of the sukkahs are going to be puzzle? Hechidami, says the Gemara, kegon de tarvaihu tzilsan meruba mitzilsan. If both of the sukkahs have more shade than they have light, and v'kaima ha'elyona lemala me'asara amma, and now the sukkah on top is a sukkah psula. This is your case of sukkah tachas sukkah. That's usher. The other case of sukkah tachas sukkah was mutter. But in this case, the above sukkah is going to be puzzle. It is a sukkah, and therefore the sukkah is above that's puzzle. Therefore, the one underneath is going to be a problem. Third case, last line, Testament base. Sometimes the lower sukkah will be kosher and the upper sukkah will be puzzle. Top of Yodam and Aleph, Hechidami. How do we know that this to be the case? We'll have enough time to finish. If the lower sukkah has more shade than sun, the elyona chamsa meruba mitzilsa, and the upper sukkah has more sun than shade. The kaime tarvaihu besoch esrim, and both of them are going to be within 20. That is a case where the lower sukkah will be kosher because it has enough schach. The upper sukkah doesn't have enough schach, so it's not a sukkah. It's not a sukkah. Al shem schach kriya sukkah. Last case, third line down. Upamim shaha'elyona ksheira v'tachtona psula. What about that case where the upper sukkah is kosher and the lower sukkah is pasul? Hechidami, says the Gemara, kigon de tarvaihu tzilsan meruba mechamsan. That's a case where what's the case where elyona ksheira and tachtona psula, where the upper one is kosher and the bottom one is pasul. The case is where both sukkahs have enough schach. The kaima elyona besoch esrim, and the upper sukkah is within 20, and that is problematic because the upper sukkah is in fact a proper sukkah, and this as well, the Meforshim explain, is a case of sukkah tachas sukkah, and that's why it is going to be problematic. So says the Gemara, you haven't said any chiddush in the last 12 lines, 15 lines, whatever it was. All of that was obvious. The author of this line was Rav Yirmiyah. So says the Gemara to Rav Yirmiyah, pshita. None of that was rocket science. We understand that if the upper sukkah is puzzled, the lower sukkah is going to have a problem. If there's not enough schach on the top, but there is enough, then you're applying general formulaic stuff. It's not complicated. So says the Gemara, that's not true. Tachtona ksher v'elyona psula itzrichale. We needed Rav Yirmiyah's comment, his lengthy comment, because of the case where the sukkah at the bottom is kosher, but where the one at the top is puzzle. Why? Because mahu detema, I might have thought to say nigzor, that we should make a gzeira dilma mitztarv schach puzzle bahade schach kosher kamash malan. I might have thought that we would look at the schach of the upper sukkah, which is schach that is too thin. We might have thought that schach would merge as schach psula, and that would be problematic. Kamash malan, that we don't look at it that way. And on that note, the Gemara is going to pivot for the last sugya of the evening. We're 8 lines down at Kama Yehe. Says the Gemara, Kama Yehe ben sukkah lo sukkah teha tachtona psula. This question is really asking, how thick can your schach be? Right? Let's say that I have a layer of schach that's perfect. And 3 tvachim above, I have another layer of schach that's perfect. or 3 tvachim above, I have another lev schach that's not perfect. When do we look at it as one unit, and when do we look at it as possibly problematic units? To ask the question in the Gemara's terminology, how do we know when we're in a case of sukkah tachas sukkah? Okay, so that's what the Gemara wants to know. Kama yehe bein sukkah lesukkah te'ah tachtona psula. How much of a space do we need between the schach of the bottom sukkah and the schach of the top sukkah for it to be a problematic? 3 answers. Answer number 1, Amar Rav Huna tefach. The answer is a tefach. 1 tefach of space can cause a lot of problems. Where do we know this from? Shekain matzinu be'ohel de tuma tefach. We've learned this already when it comes to tumas ohel. This is how, actually, in practical terms, that how people are buried. They're covered in a way where there isn't a lot of space to make sure that the tumas ohel can't travel. How does this work? The Brisa writes, the Mishnah writes, 1/3 of the way down. Tefach al tefach berum tefach. This is 1 tefach by 1 tefach by 1 tefach, otherwise known as a cube. That's about 4. It's 4 cubed. It's 4 by 4 by 4. So whatever, that's about this wide. Okay, it's about, it looks kind of like a larger size Rubik's Cube, approximately. That amount of space between the schach of the lower sukkah and the schach of the upper sukkah is enough to cause a problem. How? Because in the world of tumas ohel, once you have a space that is that space of the cube of a tefach, then maybe it causes all of these problems. But when the space, as it relates to tumas ohel, is less than that cube of tefach al tefach al tefach, then no tuma can transfer. What does that show you? That a tefach is a significant separator. Because by tumas ohel, that's the line in the sand. That's shita number 1. Rav Chizda v'Rabba bar Rav Huna amrei arba. They say 4. Why do they say 4? Because, says the Gemara, shalom matzinu makom chashuv pachos mi arba. We don't have a halachic space that's deemed valuable that's less than 4. A sharp contrast to the previous shita that showed us something that's unique about 1. But what we saw in regards to tumas ohel wasn't about a makom. That wasn't a makom. It was considered a space. But we need it to be sukkah eligible. It needs to have a status of a space. But this is still a hard answer. He only says it's 4. That doesn't really help, because we know that normally a sukkah has to be 10 tvachim, and that's the 3rd shita, and the shita we're going to spend the rest of the day on. Ushmuel amar asara. He says there has to be a gap of 10 tefach between the sukkah, the schach of the bottom sukkah, and the schach of the top sukkah. My time of Shmuel. What is the reason that Shmuel says that there has to be a gap of 10? And he answers with something that should resonate just so simply with us. Why? Because we've learned this already. Kehechshera kach psula. Whatever it is that makes a sukkah kosher, in this case, a minimum height of 10 tefachim, that's the same exact thing that can cause it a problem. So the sukkah on top, 4 tefachim, that's not a sukkah. In order for there to be a case of sukkah tachas sukkah, kehechshera kach psula, that the lower sukkah only has a status of being a sukkah if it has 10 tefachim. The upper sukkah, its schach is only sukkah schach if it's 10 tefachim. Very, very reasonable answer. And the Gemara continues to explain Shmuel. Mahechshera ba'asara, just like making a sukkah kosher is with 10 tefachim, af psula ba'asara, so too the psul would have to be that way. And therefore, to answer our question that we started with, how much of a gap does there have to be between the lower sukkah and the upper sukkah? 3 answers. Tefach in the name of the first Amora, 4 Tefachim in the name of the second Amora, and 10 Tefachim in the name of the third. Questioning Shmuel, we're going to look at our Mishnah. Tnan. The Mishnah says halfway down, 4 lines before the wide lines. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Im ein diurin be'alyona hatachtona kshera. We saw this in our Mishnah at the top of Testament Beis. Rabbi Yehuda said this seemingly strange line that if no one's living upstairs in the upstairs sukkah, then the lower one is kosher. My ein diurin. What does that mean that nobody's living there? Do you think that Ilema Diur and Mamish, that it's actually talking about actually people living in the sukkah? Is people living in the sukkah the determining factor of a kosher sukkah? Says the Gemara, Atu Diur and Kagarmi? That's what makes a sukkah kosher? No. Obviously, it doesn't mean someone physically has to live in the sukkah. That's not what it means. Elalav, my ein diurin. What does it mean, ein diurin? It just means it has to be a livable place. Kol she'ein ru'uya ledira. He says that if the upper sukkah is not ra'ui ledira, then the lower one is going to be kosher. So then if that's the case, v'hechidami, kol she'ein ru'uya ledira, v'hechidami, what's that case? Delo gvoa asara. And that upper sukkah would have to then be 10. But that is the sheet of Rabbi Yehuda in our Mishnah on Testament Beis. What does that imply? if Rabbi Yehuda is talking on the third line of the Mishnah on Testament Beis, who was the Tanakama? Says the Gemara over here at the first of the very long lines on Yud Amud Aleph, Michlal, what does that imply about the Tanakama? Michlal, the Tanakama Savar, Afal Pisha Enu Ru'i Ladira Psula. The Tanakama seems to be of the opinion that even if the upper sukkah isn't 10 tfachim, it's not Ru'i Ladira, that the lower sukkah would still be puzzled. That doesn't make sense with Shmuel, Kasha and Shmuel. Shmuel, how do you fit with the Tanakama? Now, I have my own question. Why doesn't the Gemara just say he holds like Rabbi Yehuda? I don't know. It seems like an easy answer. But the Gemara doesn't say that. It's questioning because it gets the Tanakama is the Chachamim. It's Yachid v'Rabbi, Malacha Karabim. We probably paskin like the Tanakama. So answers the Gemara. Ki asa Rav Dimi. The reason why this brisa is not a problem for Shmuel is because when Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael, Amar, he said, Amre b'ma'arava, they said out in the west, they said in Eretz Yisrael, Im eina tachtona yechola lekabel kara muksaso shalal yona hatachtona kshera. He says, because we're not talking about 10. It has to be ru'uya ladira in another way. That if the floor of the second sukkah, which is the schach of the first sukkah, isn't strong enough to hold the weight of kar muksasos, the pillows and the blankets that people are going to sleep on, so then atachtona kshera. That's not considered, the upper space is not considered a place to live. It's not strong enough to handle the people walking, the people living, the people having sudas up there, and therefore that upper sukkah is possible, the lower sukkah is kshera. Yet here the Gemara still has a question. Michlal, this implies that if Rabbi Yehuda was of that opinion, that the Tanakama differs, the Tanakama Savar, that Afal Pisha En Ru'i Lakabel Psula, that even though the upper sukkah is not Roi Lakabel, but it's puzzle, this violates the principle that Shmuel says above, halfway down, because it's not a livable place. And seemingly this would make things very difficult for Shmuel. So the Gemara answers with finality, and then we'll stop at this Mishnah. You've misunderstood the Machlokas, Rabbi Yehuda and the Tanakama. Really, Rabbi Yehuda and the Tanakama are arguing about what if it's like just enough, it's just strong enough, the roof of the bottom sukkah, the schach of the bottom sukkah, which is the floor of it's just strong enough. So that's the Machlokas al Yedei Adchak, that Rabbi Yehuda would be lenient and the Tanakama would not be lenient. We'll stop right here. We will pick up on Shabbos at 5:30, earlier than usual, to compensate for all the eating that needs to take place. And on Shabbos, we're going to learn Yud Amud Beis and Yud Aleph, and that will bring us all the way until Monday night. We won't have to do any learning. I mean, we have to learn, but we won't have shiur until Monday night, which will be for Daf Yud Beis. Wishing you all a beautiful night.
How do you feel about